one of the ways to change a field is to become involved in it. And our next speaker is going to address that more specifically and talk about how the field of linguistics is starting to change for the betterment of Indian country. Dr. Wesley Leonard is a citizen of the Myaami tribe of Oklahoma and assistant professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside. And his talk is Decolonizing Linguistic Science Through Native American Participation. Anyway.
Yeah.
Slipping on it.
Oh. Aia cheke. Te pewene o laka koke nungi ka hikwe. Kinuzawi awenswa ane nila Myaamia. So I hope you all had a good lunch. And I appreciate your words, Nika, in that you've provided a great segue into what I already have prepared as my introduction. So as many of you know, I became a linguist as a way of serving my own Myaami tribal community in our efforts to reclaim our Myaamia language. This began with a bachelor's degree in linguistics, which I received 20 years ago, or it will be 20 years in a couple of months, here at Miami University. And later I went on to graduate school, earning a PhD in linguistics in 2007 with a focus on language learning in context of Myaamia language reclamation. My general experience over these 20 plus years as a tribal member, a linguistics student, and now a professional linguist has been, as Daryl was saying, that the tools of linguistic analysis can be tremendously helpful, and in some cases outright necessary, for addressing Native American language community needs, which almost always involve language reclamation needs. That said, there's also been an ongoing struggle throughout my experiences as a Native American linguist because of the colonial assumptions, socialization, and research norms that have been built into the field of linguistics, as well as academia more widely, as we heard about this morning. My recent work is focused on challenging this paradigm, both as a matter of social justice and also as part of a desire to improve linguistic science, given that Native American ideas about language and about research have a lot to offer to non-Native people. In this talk, my aim is to illustrate some of my recent work in this area. Recognizing that today's audience is diverse, I'll start with an overview of what I mean by linguistic science and linguistics, and also what it means conceptually to decolonize it by reframing it around Native American ways of knowing. I'm going to spend the rest of my talk discussing a National Science Foundation funded workshop that had this, Decolonizing Linguistic Science, as its theme, and I'll share with you some of the outcomes of that workshop. My interpretations of these outcomes, by the way, are heavily informed by my experiences within the Myaami tribal community, and of course, as I noted, my foundational linguistics education occurred here at Miami University, within the Miami University community. So I think that you'll see the strong Myaami-ness throughout this talk. To give a bit of an overview about linguistic science, the very early work in linguistics was in what's called philology, the kind of history of languages and how they are related to each other. But in terms of linguistics as a more named field, this is really getting going in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as a subfield of the field of anthropology. At this time, linguists had a very strong interest in language structure, and with a heavy focus on describing Native American languages. Interestingly, although Native American languages are very, very diverse, the descriptions of these languages tend to have a lot in common. This is pointed out by linguistic anthropologist Joseph Arrington in his 2008 book, Linguistics in a Colonial World. Arrington notes that the descriptions themselves tend to follow the same patterns because under the academic assumptions of the time, people were describing what was an object with the same basic principles, just filling in different details. They were not using native definitions of language in making those descriptions of those native languages. In the 1960s and onward, linguistics separated from anthropology and became more of a cognitive science. That is, a science that's interested in how the brain works, particularly in this case in terms of language acquisition, why languages grammatically end up in a certain way and not in others. As part of this work, which continues today, there's been a significant focus on language universals, that is to say, things that all human languages have in common, the idea being that these universals can be gleaned from analysis of very broad sets of language data that, in many cases, is very socially decontextualized. I use the term data on purpose here because I think that better captures the way of thinking about this information that tends to guide the field. There are also significant efforts, or have been significant efforts since the 1960s to align linguistic science with the research norms of other STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Many people don't recognize, even in universities, that linguistics is considered STEM. That is to say, it's closer to physics than it is to literature, depending on who does it, or at least that is the push that people have made. Because that's not widely recognized, people have commented that linguists, or linguistics, in some cases have what's called physics envy. We're trying to be like physics, we're trying to be a real science, and one of the ways to do that is to get rid of all of the social stuff and make everything look very, very scientific and disconnect it even more from the communities where those languages are spoken, or the communities that have heritage to those languages. All of that said, today, there has been, Cyril was saying, increased recognition of and support for Native American community needs in linguistic research, with some individual linguists very committed to this approach. In fact, I think some individual linguists sort of commit their entire careers to this approach. I'm talking here about non-Indigenous people. However, and this is a big however, linguistics tends to impose colonial ideas of defining, valuing, and analyzing language in ways that contradict the needs and values of Native American communities. When I say colonial, I mean imposing Western ways of knowing at the expense of Native American ways of knowing. Even in situations where Native American languages are valued and recognized, linguistic analysis often creates conflicts by isolating, fragmenting, and dissecting language in ways that can be very alienating to Native American community members for whom language is not an object that can be or should ever be conceptualized separately from peoplehood, from power, from spirituality, and so on. In response to these trends, my recent research has focused on improving linguistic science by pointing out these problems and providing ways to correct them. This begins with deconstructing how the field of linguistics currently defines itself, the common claim being that it is the scientific study of language. Well, this isn't true. It kind of is. To capture this reality, I've prepared this slide that you can see here, in which I note that linguistics is not the same as linguistics. Of course, the difference here is in the capitalization. I've adopted a convention of using capital L linguistics to refer to the scope, conventions, and epistemologies, that is, ways of gathering information, of the scientific study of language in the academic field that is called linguistics, and that's represented by professional organizations and by departments at universities. Very, very important to recognize is that this is not the same as what I'm calling lowercase l linguistics, which I'm defining as the scientific study of language in the broadest possible sense, where definitions of language and ways of producing and disseminating knowledge need not be limited to the norms of the named academic field as it currently exists. My hope is to strengthen uppercase L linguistics by bringing it closer to lowercase l linguistics, and specifically by bringing Native American needs and views of language into the field as a way of decolonizing it. So I've been referencing this idea of decolonization, and at this point I should define that as well, because many people use this term differently. When I talk about decolonizing, decolonization, I'm thinking of something like this, provided a working definition that comes from a couple of Native scholars who say that decolonization is the intelligent, calculated, and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and/or exploitation of Native American minds, bodies, and lands. And for our purposes today, to this last part of the sentence, we can add language in terms of how it is defined, given value, taught, learned, studied, and so on. Decolonization in this particular context, and certainly as I use it, does not mean erasing anything and everything that happened to be introduced via colonization. It does not in any way imply that, say, Miami people or other Native people could not be global citizens making use of languages and ways of knowing and experiences that don't come from Native American backgrounds. What it does mean is that those other ways of knowing cannot be imposed on Native American backgrounds, which is in fact what's been happening in the United States. Decolonization also entails valuing what's known as intellectual sovereignty. It's defined here by my colleague Sherry Tatch as the right to create, interpret, evaluate, and conceive without the willful assault of Euro-American languages, values, and social norms. Keywords here are willful assault. So again, it's not claiming that somebody wouldn't make use of Euro-American languages, values, and social norms, but rather that those would be used in a thoughtful way and would not be imposed upon, in this case, Native American languages. Linguistic research very much can occur in ways that respect tribal intellectual sovereignty, but not, again, when it imposes Euro-American values and categories. Speaking more generally, not just for linguistic science, tribal intellectual sovereignty entails that research ideas, research methods, and research products should emerge from tribal needs and values. They can certainly draw from ideas that come from elsewhere, but only, again, in a thoughtful way after those outside ideas have been deemed to be culturally appropriate and potentially useful. I say potentially useful as opposed to useful because sometimes you don't know until you test out the idea. I'd now like to move into an overview of the larger project, Expanding Linguistic Science by Broadening Native American Participation, which is the title of a grant proposal that I wrote a year ago and which was funded last summer by the National Science Foundation Documenting Endangered Languages Program with a generous $150,000 award. This workshop, or rather I should say the larger project, evolved out of the ongoing experiences that I referenced at the beginning of my talk, so that linguistics is useful, and yet it also gets imposed, in terms of Western categories, get imposed on Native peoples in ways that are very, very problematic. My idea in crafting this proposal was that one of the ways to address that was to call attention to it by having a big workshop of Native people at the main professional gathering of linguists in the United States, this being the annual Linguistic Society of America conference, the most recent one of which took place January 4th through 7th in Salt Lake City, and that's the one that I'm talking about specifically. The Linguistic Society of America annual conference is the academic conference in linguistics, probably the largest in the world, with over 1,000 participants. I don't know exactly how many there were for this year. I know it was 1,200 the previous year, and I couldn't find the most recent number. But there were over 300 presentations, over 150 posters. This is the conference where an aspiring graduate student wants to get a paper accepted. You know, this is sort of the big deal. Notably, Native American language needs and values generally are not well represented in the Linguistic Society of America annual conference, but there are other linguistics conferences where these issues are much more prominent, in some cases even the focus. I chose not to have the workshop at one of those more Native-friendly conferences, but rather to go right to the top. Okay, this is akin to going to Washington, D.C., saying, no, it's all linguists, particularly those who are in leadership roles who need to get these ideas, who need to hear this information, and who need to hear these ideas directly from Native people. An ongoing problem in capital L linguistics that this proposal was responding to was the severe underrepresentation of Native Americans, particularly at the PhD level, which becomes important in that it is these folks, those who have PhDs in linguistics, who have an outsized say in setting the norms of the field in terms of its research goals, its ethics, the norms of teaching linguistics, who gets hired to be a linguist, and so on. Again, the challenge is that many Native Americans experience colonial ideas and values when they engage with the field, and very few thus choose to pursue academic linguistics as a profession. In fact, according to research by the National Science Foundation, the most recent report coming from 2017, between 2004 and 2014, out of 2,420 linguistics PhD recipients at United States universities, with 1,369 of these being US citizens or permanent residents, from the latter group, 8 were Native American. The classification technically used here is American Indian or Alaska Native, which is commonly used in the United States. So it's 8 out of 1,369, with the remainder, these being non-US citizens who are getting PhDs in linguistics in the United States, not broken down by ethnicity, but presumably most of them were not American Indians, at least not from United States tribes. They might have been indigenous from some other place. So 8 in 10 years. Sometimes I look at these numbers and I see that in 2007, there was one person, and I know who it was. I am 12.5% of the total, which is kind of neat but also pathetic. This is not good. There are a lot of talented Native people out there with an interest in contributing to linguistic science and who can bring valuable Native intellectual traditions and community perspectives into the field of linguistics. This, again, was my motivation for holding this workshop at the main professional gathering of linguists. Native people would participate in the broader conference, share their ideas, and so on, and kind of make the place into a Native space, which has never occurred before. You'll notice here that this was actually the 92nd annual Linguistic Society of America conference. In 92 years, this was the first time we had a Native drum there. This is the first time we had a significant Native presence there. It was the first time, at least sort of at the broader conference level, that there was some acknowledgement of local indigenous people in a formal way. The policy has been changing in the Linguistic Society of America such that they're going to start doing those things every year from now on as a result of this workshop. In any case, what happens with the Linguistic Society of America, which always meets the first Thursday through Sunday after New Year's Day, is that the conference starts late Thursday afternoon or evening. In this case, it started at 4 p.m. So very often, people will hold special workshops of some sort earlier in the day that Thursday, and that's what we did. Using this conference grant, created, along with my collaborators, a program that we informally called Natives for Linguistics. The idea was that we would have an all-day workshop that Thursday exploring themes of decolonizing linguistic science, sharing Native American needs and values of language, and that the participants in this smaller workshop would then participate in the broader linguistics conference, going to regular sessions, asking questions. Some of them were also presenters in that session. We also, as a means of educating linguists more broadly, held a 3-hour symposium the Saturday of the conference. It's called Sharing Our Views, Native Americans Speak About Language and Linguistics. It was the first ever symposium, as far as I know, that featured entirely Native presenters. Again, 92 years. Finally, the participants in my workshop regrouped on the last day of the conference, late morning that Sunday, to have sort of a debriefing session of sorts, to create plans for the future, to talk about our experiences at the conference, and also to make recommendations to representatives from the Linguistic Society of America and from other relevant professional organizations that were represented there at the conference. Basically saying, this is what we observed, this part was good, these other parts were lousy and need to change. You can see here on my slide that there were 48 participants in this workshop. These participants were chosen by a selection committee through what ended up being a very highly competitive application process last fall with over 100 applicants, such that we had to turn down a lot of very talented people. In some ways, it's a good problem to have, but also unfortunate because there really were a lot of very good applicants. Within this, of the 48 participants, 2 are Myaamiaki. And Jared, where's Jared? Yeah. 2 are Myaamiaki. And I like to think of the groups, or of the participants, in 3 categories, and these were the 3 categories that we referenced in the application process. The first category is Native American community scholars. We were defining these people, so I say language teachers, program leaders, language speakers, people who are involved in language activism, people who are scholars in some general sense of the term, but who are not linguists specifically. Second category is non-native linguists who engage in this type of work. This would be regular professional linguists who are not themselves native, but whose work significantly involves Native American languages and Native American communities. Very, very often, this is the binary that gets presented. we've got, how should linguists work with native people, or something like that, which I find very, very problematic because, of course, in some cases, an individual person can be both native and also linguist. And so for that reason, we had a third category, Native American community scholars who are also linguists. And in fact, there were several people who applied in that category. And here we all are. This was at the Grand America Hotel in Salt Lake City, which is a very European-inspired place. And the symposium that we held was in a room called the Imperial Ballroom. So there were all sorts of ironies, but we worked with it. So here are some of the insights that came out of the workshop. One involves decolonizing language itself, the concept of language. So we say that linguistics is a scientific study of language, but language defined by whom? In fact, contemporary linguistic science privileges certain ways of defining language, particularly by structural units, grammatical units. Phonetics for sound, phonology for sound patterns, morphology for word chunks or full words, and syntax for clauses. Very often, these units can or are described and analyzed not only separately from each other, but also separately from the people who speak these languages, thus contradicting common Native American norms of engaging with interrelatedness as a basic framework of describing and interacting with the world, or in this case, of doing linguistic analysis. It's not my claim that this approach is inherently wrong. Rather, my point is that while these conventions are informed by data from diverse languages, including those of Native North America, they come out of Western epistemologies of language and science, and in this way are limited. They can also be harmful when they recast native languages in ways that disregard the associated community's intellectual traditions and values about language. Structure, so grammar, becomes the logic by which language is taught or explained, and while this can be very useful at times, in the situations of language reclamation that are common in Native American communities, learning grammar is usually a means to an end, not the end itself. Decolonization entails an approach to linguistic science that is instead centered in Native American definitions of language, and that recognizes how these can serve as a foundation for linguistic work, not just for native languages, but across the board. The basis for identifying research needs, for posing the research questions, for applying methods, for disseminating findings, for teaching about language, for purposes of evaluating the work of professional linguists, and so on. For this reason, the Natives for Linguistics workshop included a session that morning, Thursday morning, on defining language, sharing definitions of language. And I'd now like to share with you some of the ideas that emerged. What you see here comes from a graphic recorder that I hired as part of this workshop. Graphic recording is note-taking by drawing pictures. So we hired a graphic recorder based in the UK, but who happened to be in Salt Lake City at the appropriate time, to document these sorts of discussions. And so she documented them in real time and drew pictures, and then later digitized some of those pictures. And so the images that I'm using today in this talk are the digitized versions. This one here says, what are our definitions of language? It says languages, and in the lower left part of the screen, it says medicine, power, identity, prayer, diversity, spirituality, purpose. Structural units did not come into the conversation, at least from the native participants. Language is identity. Language is spirituality. If languages are defined in this way, then what are the implications for doing research on language? What are the associated ethics? This isn't just a set of grammatical patterns. This is somebody's identity. Engaged in a research project a few years ago in which I was interviewing Native Americans about ideas on language. And one of the people I had the pleasure of interviewing was Jared Baldwin. Again, there you are, now I know. And I asked Jared, what is language? Of course, and Jared is also a participant in the Natives for Linguistics workshop, and so I imagine he was sharing these kinds of ideas. He was speaking specifically about the Myaamia community and noted that language is how a community connects to each other and how they express themselves and their culture to each other. So working with views such as this one, how a community connects to each other and how they express themselves and their culture to each other, would likely yield a very different type of linguistic science, one in which language is fully intertwined at all times with social interactions, and where community ways of knowing inform how research is created and disseminated. Within the Natives for Linguistics workshop, we also discussed decolonizing the assumptions and the norms of linguistics, capital L linguistics. So we might then, to sort of frame this, ask how are languages supposed to, that's in quotation marks, exist and to be transmitted? Many of the assumptions that are out there and the associated categories and theories are based on norms for widely spoken languages, and this can be extremely problematic for Native American communities who, due to language ruptures, are not currently following the said norms. For example, consider the adjective natural, as I've observed its use in discussions of language learning, specifically to refer to child language acquisition in the home, but not to other means of developing linguistic competence, which by extension become unnatural. These so-called unnatural modes of learning notably happen to be essential in processes of language reclamation from documentation, at least in its initial stages. Unnatural doesn't mean inherently bad, but in my observation is that it's often perceived in this way. The same idea applies to the noun speaker, and using it only to refer to people who naturally acquired the language under consideration as children. There are serious problems with taking a prototype from a given category and referring to it with the name of the category, which is actually a larger unit. This delegitimizes the diverse experiences of Native Americans with language, specifically where many of us have to learn our languages in unconventional ways and don't become grammatically fluent speakers, but certainly are using our languages in meaningful ways. Even more extreme are situations when the languages themselves are erased from contemporary life for reasons stemming from their social contexts. As I've discussed in previous Myaamiaki conference presentations, the E word, extinct, gets applied to languages that lack living first language speakers even when they've never been irretrievably lost, an increasing number of cases that have been brought back into use from documentation. This metaphor of extinction falls within a larger colonial practice of relegating Native Americans to history as opposed to recognizing us as peoples who have histories. This, in turn, leads to the erasure of our contemporary needs and values. Decolonizing linguistic science entails eschewing the extinction metaphor altogether, and more generally of avoiding what might be called past tense descriptions in regards to Native peoples, except, of course, when somebody is intending to talk about the past. The Natives for Linguistics workshop participants also noted that the norms of transcription and translation need more conversations. Here, the idea is that there are problems with how languages are written, sometimes with words broken up into grammatical parts without ever being written as full words, translations not capturing indigenous cultural context or overly being focused on the linguist's analysis and not on how the speakers of a language would translate something into English or whatever language of wider communication is being used. And then we talked of decolonizing linguistic research and the researcher's role. Here we might ask, how does the researcher's positionality matter? What is objective science? As noted earlier, capital L linguistics, with its goal of being legitimate as a STEM field, often de-emphasizes the identity of the researcher under the assumption that the scientific results should come out the same, regardless of who's doing the investigation or in what cultural context it is occurring. After all, this is based on empirical data. That said, even though language data sets sort of exist on their own, the packaging of them as sets of data, the considerations of something as meaningful data, the decision of what to include and how to represent it, those are all heavily, heavily culturally informed. A decolonized linguistics would strongly emphasize the importance for linguistics educators and researchers to always acknowledge and consider their positionalities. By positionalities, I don't just mean social positions, but the types of social positions that somebody has and how they came to exist and how they exist in relation to other social positions, particularly in terms of power relationships. Doing so is crucial to being able to responsibly engage in science and to interpret somebody else's findings. A related idea involves the notion of objectivity in science. In terms of the importance of reporting on what's actually there, even if it's not what one wants to be there, I agree with this idea. But the practice of framing science as objective often actually functions as code for elevating Western ways of observing and reporting on the world at the expense of native and other intellectual traditions. A decolonized linguistics would recognize that all scholars interpret evidence through cultural lenses and in relation to previous experience. This is aligned with Native American norms of emphasizing who you are and where you came from, and asking the same of others so that you're able to interact with them in responsible ways and understand their points of view. From an emphasis on positionality, of course, comes an emphasis on relationships and reciprocity. The Natives for Linguistics workshop participants noted, if you're dealing with indigenous language, don't just keep it to yourself, share with the community. Once you acknowledge who you are and you develop relationships with the people you're working with, this reciprocity almost naturally follows, because you would not be able to continue doing that work if you were not behaving in appropriate ways. Finally, the workshop participants noted that a decolonized linguist would challenge academic hierarchies and the marginalization of applied work. What happens here is that very often theoretical academic work is far more valued than applied academic work, but starting from native ways of knowing, things that are useful are going to be more valued, and so there'll be a flip-flop. This becomes very, very important because the type of work that somebody does and the value associated with it determines whether they get a job and keep a job, whether they're able to continue doing that work, whatever it may be. The workshop participants called for a change. So due to time constraints, I'll end my examples with this last point, but to close, I want to make one final summary statement, which is this. Native American peoples, including Myamis, have valuable intellectual and cultural traditions of creating and sharing knowledge. Centering this principle in the discipline of linguistics would yield a better linguistic science. Mishinewe.